Welcome everyone to Focus Radio. Today we have the incredible honor of speaking with one of the foremost experts on human behavior, neuroscience, and stress, Dr. Sapolsky. Dr. Sapolsky is a professor of neuroscience, primatology, and biology at Stanford University, and he's widely recognized for his pioneering work on the neurobiology of stress and the biological foundations of behavior. Dr. Sapolsky is the author of several influential books, including Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers and Behave, the Biology of Humans at Our Best and Worst, which have reshaped my and I think our understanding of how biology influences our actions. And his most recent book that kind of screwed me up in many ways, Determined, a Science of Life Without Free Will, that delves into one of the most kind of provocative and thought-provoking questions of all, which makes it, what does it mean for us if we don't have free will? It challenges the way we think about responsibility, morality, and human agency, offering a revolutionary perspective based on science. Sir, your ability to combine rigorous research with deep philosophical insights has made you one of the most respected voices in the field. I'm so excited to dive into your knowledge, your experience, and how determined you are. Dr. Sapolsky, it's an absolute pleasure to have you on the podcast, and thank you for joining us today.
Well, thanks. Thanks for having me here.
So I'm going to cut to the chase. Your book is just amazing. It's a book that I need to read again and again. Same that I did with Behave. The same with The Trouble with all your books, actually. And I've read a letter to you. I think I'm going to try to read it at some point here. But redefining the agency. If neuroscience suggests free will is an illusion, how might we redefine agency in a way that preserves kind of the essence of human autonomy?
Well, I think the problem is, the challenge for lots of people is you got to give up the essence of human autonomy. People have been debating whether or not there's free will forever. And it's only in the last, century or two that it's had any sort of biological tinge to it. And I'm of the particular school of thought that when you look at the nuts and bolts biology of where behavior comes from, there's absolutely no room in there for free will. There cannot be any free will whatsoever, which puts me way out on the lunatic fringe of people in this business in terms of just how adamantly I think the science is pointing us towards. So I think that insofar as there's no free will, which every now and then I can convince someone of, the implications are that there's no agency, there's no responsibility, there's no blame, there's no praise, there's no reward, there's no punishment. All we are is simply the end product of our biological environmental luck.
How does it make you feel being the lunatic, the heretic? Are you enjoying it?
Well, I knew I very lamentably, in the aftermath of the book coming out last year, an overwhelming percentage of the book reviews were written by philosophers who were virtually without exception extremely hostile, and basically said, how could I say anything about the subject if I had not memorized every word that Immanuel Kant had written, in which my response was, how could you talk about the subject if you don't know how a neuron works, let alone how a brain works? So it's a little bit of a disciplinary, cat fight over whether the notion of us being behaving organisms is the realm of biology or the realm of philosophy. And I think without any question, we're animals, we're biological organisms, we're very fancy ones, and we can't make any sense of our biology of behavior outside the context of social factors and psychological and all. But nonetheless, at the end of the day, we're nothing more or less than the sum of our biological building blocks.
With taking the ground basics of biology, and you've seen you studied primatology and the behavior in so many kind of environments, but how do you reconcile the kind of the apparent predictability of neural patterns with the chaotic, nonlinear nature of human behavior in such a complex social environment?
Which is a great question, and the answer is, it's not hugely predictive. Destroy somebody's prefrontal cortex and you talk to them for 3 minutes, and the odds are you're going to notice that there's something odd with them. And you hang out with them for 30 minutes and you're on pretty safe ground predicting that they're going to do something slightly socially inappropriate. But whether that's going to take the form of murdering someone or belching loudly at the dinner table when that's not really welcome, no predictability with that. And that carries an important punchline. You sit and you study neuroscience, and it does not disprove free will because there's too many pieces there that we can't predict yet. And you go and you study endocrinology and what hormones do to behavior, and it doesn't rule out free will. And you study genetics, same thing. And you study fetal environment, and you study the evolution of behavior, and none of them on its own rule out free will, but put all the pieces together. And there's simply no room in there. And it's not because, the shortcoming in one discipline, the hole in one discipline is plugged up by some other discipline. The answer is that you put all of those together and they're one discipline. Like, for example, if you're talking about what genes have to do with behavior, by definition, you're talking about millions of years of evolution of genes. And by definition, you're talking about what sort of womb you spent 9 months in, because that had a ton to do with the regulation of genes for your entire life. And you're also talking about what was going on in your brain this morning at breakfast in terms of what genes were active making which proteins. And it forms this big arch of causality, of biology interacting environmental. And when you see one discipline flowing into the next, in terms of sort of this matrix of explanation, there's not a crack in that edifice in which you could shoehorn in free will. Because all of the versions of shoehorning in say at some point, you get to break all the rules. You get to have magic.
To be honest, and it's frustrating, people take one gene and they make so many theories. And I see genes like we've got 20,000 people, right, that they're trying to communicate. And I always say, okay, we know this gene, what it does, but what it does in a specific environment, what it does when it tries to communicate with the rest 19,999 genes, and what would change in a affluent kind of area, what would happen during war, what would happen in specific ages. And I think we're kind of missing the plot just by saying this gene, you've got this gene, this is just going to happen. And
yes, exactly. I agree.
Isn't that frustrating?
Well, we're in the genomics era. I mean, science spent a boatload of money back in the 90s sequencing the human genome, and that was unimaginable. That was the holy grail of reductive laboratory science. And, you do that, and a lot of people work on it, and you come out with a whole lot of bits of data at the other end. And you come away mighty impressed with it and decide that genes are the beginning and the end and the code of codes and everything in between. And as I was saying, you can't eliminate free will by only studying genetics. You can't understand humans by only studying genetics, let alone getting all obsessed and spending your whole life going on about one gene or just a handful of genes. is just part of the whole story. And some of the most dramatic examples of it are there's variants of genes that, ooh, if you're a lab rat or you're a monkey, you have that variant, you're going to have inappropriately high levels of aggression. Whoa, let's look at the human version of that gene variant. Do you see the same thing? Is that the genetic basis of violence? And what you see is people who have that variant do have higher rates of antisocial violence, if and only if they were abused as children. And if they weren't abused, having that gene variant has no effect whatsoever. So, whoa, what does that gene tell us? Zilch. It tells us nothing unless you know the environment in which that person's genes were operating. So genes just in and of themselves are certainly not the be all or end all. There's a terrible bias to view that genes run everything in your cells and thus in your organs and thus in all of you. And genes have no idea what they're doing.
They're just waiting.
They're just waiting. The metaphor I like the most is like saying that a gene knows what it's doing and decides what to do to your cell or your body or you, is like saying the recipes in a cookbook decide when it's time to make a cake. Nah, it's just the readouts. It's just the readout. It's where you look up one type of instruction manual.
I know you observed cross-cultural differences in how individuals process the concept of free will. Can we input that in a neurological level?
Well, there's broad features of cross-cultural anthropology, cross-cultural evolutionary psychology, cross-cultural genetics, which is a tiny field, but absolutely fascinating. And you put all those features together, and what you see is certain types of ecosystems produce certain types of cultures that could be dramatically different in every way you can imagine, including stuff like how much are we the captains of our fate? And I have no idea whatsoever, because I can't possibly emphasize on what ignorant thin ice I'm skating on right now. But seemingly Buddhism is a tradition that's not terribly hung up about us being agents of our own actions. That's the entirety of my knowledge of that subject. But somehow that turned out that way, and that's a very different view than American Horatio Alger, pull yourself up your bootstraps, sort of infinite malleability. Yeah, different cultures have very, very different views on this. Different ecosystems produce different sorts of cultures. And
we'll go back to the environment.
Yeah, exactly.
That's
very deep environment.
100%. And do you think advances in neuroscience might one day kind of resolve philosophical debates about free will, or will the gap kind of between empirical and metaphysical explanations persist?
Well, big picture answer is once you get the neuroscience plus the endocrinology plus the genetics plus the developmental psych, blah, blah, all those pieces together, I believe 90% of philosophers who are, quote, deterministic compatibilists, which is a fancy way of saying they admit the world is made out of like atoms and there's such things as cells, and like we can all agree on that. Yet somehow, amazingly, that's compatible with free will still lurking around in there. So I think you put all those pieces together and you see that every compatibilist argument for free will is built on magic. But on a much more local level, every single day people prove it. Like, I don't know, 40% of Earth's population, when they get up in the morning and they neurochemically manipulate their brains and their levels of alertness by drinking coffee. Whoa, introduce a molecule into your nervous system and you function differently. Like, that is just like the first building block of we're biological machines.
It's, I think Hitchens said that in one of his talks years ago, they asked him, what do you think about free will? He says, yes, I have free will. There is no choice but to have it. And
Yeah.
there were a lot of eyebrows raised on that, but he left it there because he knows the impact of that conversation, and not more in an ethical, but in a religious kind of standpoint. And
yes,
and the aspect of free will, there's like legal systems in a deterministic world, and in practical terms, how could a legal system adapt the acknowledgement that all behavior is biologically determined?
well, this is where my lunatic fringe stance that there's no free will whatsoever begins to look very calm and moderate, because I think the implications of all of this is a criminal justice system is intellectually and ethically unacceptable, inadmissible, because you follow through the implications of this, and there's no such thing as justice or justice being served. There's no such thing as deservedness. There's no such thing as earning any sort of treatment, because blame and praise and reward and punishment make no sense at all as moral virtues in and of themselves. They could be pretty good instrumental tools for shaping behavior, and that's part of the toolkit, and it's one that begs to be overemphasized as to how effective it is. But on the pure level of like a morally justifiable intellectual stance, punishment and reward make no sense at all, because it's saying that it is okay that we have a world in which all sorts of people are treated way better than average for reasons they had nothing to do with, and all sorts of people are treated way worse for reasons they had nothing to do with. And not only is it bad enough that we're content to have a world like that, that we make it worse by then going on with gibberish about this being a just world. And it's biological luck times environmental luck, and that's what made you in this instant. And you had nothing to do with it. There is no you separate of that history of biology and environment from 1 second ago to back when humans branched off from chimps and everything in between.
This makes me, well, I'm going to do it later. I wrote a letter. It was a letter to you of many thoughts about this world, and you just answered some of that. Well, you've answered everything, because the aspect of free will and feeling that you're kind of a vessel. And sometimes I say that the captain's the brain that actually got all the information from before I was born. Well, yeah, before I was born. And then there were so many situations that made me who I am today, and the questions I'm trying to ask, which curiosity, as Ramon Cajal said, is the beginning of trying to be a scientist. But at the same time, my question is, embracing determinism makes us more compassionate, or does it risk fostering kind of apathy towards systemic injustice by framing it as inevitable?
Well, that's falling into one of the sort of black holes that pull people into deciding, whoa, even if there is no free will, don't tell anyone that, because it would be a terrible idea that people believe in it, because, ooh, if there's no free will, nothing can change. And one step after that is, so don't bother. Don't bother, because whatever the status quo is, that's simply what it is. Nothing can change, and nothing could be further from the truth. There not being free will is completely compatible with people and societies changing dramatically, as long as we get rid of the notion that we decide as agents, we decide to change. That never happens. What happens is we're changed by circumstance. And the way in which we are changed by any particular circumstance is completely a function of how we turned out to be the sort of person that we are at the instant that that circumstance occurs.
You said in order to understand the aspect of taking all the like endocrinology, biology, primatology, psychology, let's say, that bases its science in many kind of fields. Well, we need to now understand, and excuse me, Robert, right? And what kind of personal experience or early kind of academic pursuits led you to the question, or to question actually traditional notions of free will?
Well, I actually stopped believing in free will when I was 14. And I don't remember the date, but it was one night at 2:00 in the morning. I had been having somewhat of a religious crisis. I was raised very devoutly, ritualistically religious, and I really, really believed in it. And a conflict had come up that was of great personal significance to me. Where the only possible conclusion from the standpoint of religious dogma was it made sense for God to punish you for something you had absolutely nothing to do with. And whoa, when I went to my learned teachers and they basically said, tough luck, that's how it works. And it was immensely disturbing and it was irreconcilable until one night I woke up at 2 in the morning. I said, oh, I get it. There's no God. And then about 10 seconds after that, I said, oh, and there's no free will. And another 10 seconds, and it was, oh, and the universe is this vast, empty, indifferent place with no purpose and no meaning. And it's been downhill ever since then for more than 50 subsequent years. So it just evaporated in one night, all of that. Uh-oh, your sound just went out.
Hopefully. Oh, yeah.
Up, now you're back.
How did that kind of determine your worldview and influence your relationships, your regrets, or even, day-to-day decisions?
Well, despite my thinking this way now for a long, long time, most of the time I'm a flaming hypocrite because I can't actually function in a day-to-day sense as if there's no free will. I get pissed off at people. If someone says to me, whoa, what an incredibly lovely sweatshirt you're wearing, for at least a second afterward, I think I am a better human than average because of that. Yeah, on a day-to-day level, but when stuff seemingly matters, I think by now that I have somewhat of a reflex of before you judge anyone, assume you haven't a clue where their behavior actually came from. And rather than feel proud about anything, try to feel gratitude instead. And, that said, those are great. Those can be embroidered on some doily to hang up in grandma's kitchen or something. But that said, I can actually function that way a few minutes every few months or so. Nobody's saying it's easy. We are people of our place and time, and we are very inculcated into our notions of responsibility and acclaim and punishment and all that. And it's an uphill battle. And I think all one can do is just have sort of as an internal rule, if it's a circumstance where you're making an important judgment and you're judging someone harshly, stop a second and say, maybe I have no idea how they came to be the sort of person who would do that. And do that for yourself as well.
No, that's yeah, totally. And it was Viktor Frankl, I think, in his book Man's Search of Meaning, that said there's no freedom. The only freedom you have is how you choose to act. And I added there, not to react, just to add Nietzsche in there, not to react, and trying to be that kind of superhuman in a way, but in a Hans Selye kind of territory when your stress level is that high, to step back and leave that kind of hippocampus from just saying it's just so mind-boggling, like it's hard.
It's very hard, although one of the things I try to emphasize is it's doable, because we've done
True.
it over and over and over historically. I mean, if it was 400 years ago and there was a horrible thunderstorm that took out everybody's crops, you and I, as like reasonable, educated, sane people, would have a very good scientific explanation for why the thunderstorm occurred. There's a witch in the village who got some potion going and who caused it. And if we could find the right old lady with no teeth, we are totally justified then in burning her at the stake. And somewhere along the last 400 years, most people in the West, at least, kind of figured out, oh, that's not a realm where humans have agency. We can't control the weather. And then we figured out epilepsy is not a sign that somebody is like consorting with Satan. And we said, oh, it's like screwed up potassium channels in your temporal lobe. It's not you're sleeping with Beelzebub. And got rid of that. And then we figured out schizophrenia is a neurogenetic disorder. It's not caused by mothers who secretly hate their child. Autism is a neurodevelopmental. It's not caused by mothers who are incapable of love. Some kids have trouble learning to read because of the microarchitecture of one part of their brain, and they flip letters over, and they have dyslexia. And that's the problem. It's not that they're lazy and unmotivated. And with each one of these, where we've realized, whoa, I had no idea biology had something to do with why somebody suddenly has a seizure, or somebody has trouble learning, or somebody is overweight even though they desperately want to lose weight, or somebody has an off-putting personality, or any of those things. Every single time we have figured out, actually, here's the mechanistic basis of that. It's liberating, because over and over you're telling people it's not your damn fault that you have epilepsy or that you have a gene variant in your hypothalamus, so that after you eat a meal, you don't feel satiation the way most people do. And that's why you can't lose weight, not because you secretly hate yourself and you have no self-discipline. And every single time we've done that, not only doesn't the roof fall in on society, it becomes a more humane place.
But there's so much when I've had those chats with a lot of my patients and students all those years, and people are still love the witch hunt. You know what I mean? Like they love it.
Of course,
they love it. And when I send some of your kind of talks and some snippets, or try to give them the book, they call me back and it's like, I'm not sure I can read this. And I'm like, why? Like, you can understand a lot of things about how this thing functions, and then you're free.
Yeah, exactly.
But people don't want to be free.
No, and they'd much rather blame. And it's especially corrosive and psychologically questionable when people are blaming themselves for their own things out of their volition. I mean, it's a pretty crappy world when the wealthy, for example, think the poor are responsible for their poverty. It's even worse when the poor are convinced that they're responsible for their poverty. So yeah, that's not great. That's not great in any of those realms. And like I have sort of this, in my mind, kind of sarcastic punchline that if the notion of there being no free will bums you out enormously and is just so depressing and so deflating, that's a really good sign that you are a rare, lucky human. Because what you're mostly doing is congratulating yourself on your fancy university degrees or big salary, or the fact that like someone loves you or you're capable of love or any of these things. You're one of the lucky humans. If there being no free will is a bummer, it means you're one of the ones who are being treated better than average for reasons you had nothing to do with. But for most humans, all it is saying, yeah, it just turned out this way. And it's just crappy luck on your part, but this says nothing about your moral worth.
With all the research you've done, was it something that was profoundly kind of shifted your understanding on free will? Was it like something you read or someone, or was it a kind of a correlation of a lot of things altogether? Besides the 14-year-old kid that day.
Well, I think I'm somewhat of an academic dilettante in that I've spent my decades alternating between being a laboratory neuroscientist, sticking genes and neurons, stuff like that, and then for decades, each summer going out to a national park in East Africa and studying wild primates and their behavior and their physiology. And you spend part of your time doing the former, and you talk to molecular people and genetic people and all of that. And you spend your time doing the latter, and you talk to psychiatry types and economists and like social, determinants of health type people. So I think I wound up inadvertently with sort of a broad range of these things. So I think if I had been a neuroscientist who had spent the last 40 years thinking about one enzyme, the only logical conclusion I could have reached besides like, oh my God, what have I done with my life is, well, yeah, this one enzyme, you can't rule out free will with this. I think if you've been enough of a dilettante in enough different areas, my wife is a psychologist, a clinician, so that's been a whole sort of additional branch of stuff that is modically I've taken. And I think that puts you in a position to see how no single discipline does it, but put a whole lot of them together, and it turns into one discipline, and that one discipline has no room for the magic we call free will. I think all the accretion of factoids on my part, all that it's done is just weaving this net of causality with that many more, spider webs. Mm-hmm. And the key thing being, and something that is so hard cognitively to believe, is when you put all those spider webs, those gazillion influences as to how did you become who you are, all of the spider webs put together is made out of steel. It's a single steel column of this is you. This is how you became you. And you had no control over it. And it's very easy. And you get someone whose frontal cortex has been destroyed in a car accident. And appallingly, in only about a third of the states in the United States, in a courtroom, if this person has committed murder, is the jury allowed to hear that the part of the brain that controls impulsive behavior is destroyed in this individual. But if the jury hears about that with a certain frequency, they're going to say, yeah, involutional organic impairment or something, because they could say, oh, because of the car accident. That's the thing. I can see this gigantic arc made out of steel of causality from that car accident to this person sitting there in the defendant's box. But the huge intellectual challenge for all of us is, for most of us, without something dramatic like that, instead, you got to weave together a gazillion spider webs to produce something that is just as causal. But it's way harder to detect because distributed causality is really subtle.
Well, it's kind of nihilistic, and because no one's going to try to bring all the spider webs because he needs to understand his spider webs, and you know what I mean. It becomes like kind of a problem overall. And of course, when we start talking about justice and the whole system and the whole, I think it's a problem that I hope like neuroscience will shape kind of public discourse or scientific exploration in the future. What
it would be nice. I mean, at this point, It's merely what could be viewed as edge cases. I mean, if you get a neuropsychologist in the courtroom who says this person has an IQ of 65, they cannot tell the difference between right and wrong. Okay, that's a special case. We know enough about the brain to recognize that's a special case. Or this person had their frontal cortex destroyed. Or this person, their doctor accidentally gave them 10-fold higher dose of their Parkinson's disease medication, which will make you impulsive and out of control. Okay, yeah. Those are special cases. Most of us have free will, although there's times where we don't all have it. And there's some people who have a lot less than the rest of us. But once we take care of those special cases, then we can go back to blame and reward and all of that, and it's justified. Yeah, that's about as far as it's gotten.
Do you see the acknowledgement of kind of determinism and influencing kind of mental health? Like, could it alleviate kind of guilt? Because we live in a kind of guilt era. We always did, but can it kind of exacerbate kind of the helplessness? Because
one of my favorite biological psychiatrists, a guy named Torrey Fuller, who's a great guy and pioneer. He was the first person to show structural differences in the brain of people with schizophrenia, all of that. That during that era, he had a piece published in Psychology Today, that this fantasy piece of the trial, the Nuremberg type trial that would eventually be carried out for all the psychoanalysts who had spent their careers telling mothers they were responsible for their child's schizophrenia. And schizophrenogenic mothering was the fancy term for it. And it was a style of mothering that nobody could quite agree upon. But nonetheless, when like a grief-stricken mother of an 18-year-old who has just gotten a schizophrenia diagnosis would say, what caused this? Where did it come from? You, because you unconsciously wish your child had never been born. And that was decades and decades. And psychiatry is a realm in which it has been immensely freeing. Depression is not just indulging a down mood. Come on, get some backbone. Depression is as real of a biological disorder as is diabetes. Schizophrenia is not from rotten mothering. It's a combination of something happened during adolescence coupled with some vulnerability genes. Like with each one of these, there's like a genetic basis to people who can't throw stuff out, who are pathological hoarders. There's a biological base. So the biological roots of psychiatric disorders are immensely freeing. Because the psychological ones not only aren't very explanatory, but they just invite you to come up with completely nutty explanations like it's because your mother hated you. Your sound is off again.
Sorry, your work spans in biology, anthropology, psychology. What other kind of disciplines outside neuroscience do you find kind of more compelling to understand free will? It's not a trick question.
Certainly not the legal system, since their starting point is we are all endowed with, if not godly, at least naturally given agency for which we can be held responsible. And my interactions with the legal system have mostly been kind of demoralizing in terms of how not open judges and prosecutors and juries are to understanding biology. I've worked with a bunch of public defender offices on murder trials where there's been issues of sort of neurological impairment. Kind of thinking an area I wish I had remotely the energy to try to actually become educated about is stuff with child development. Because every one of these, we got to get people thinking differently about punishment and get people thinking differently about, if they did a good job at something, they deserve praise, either for their smarts or for their self-discipline. And like, how do we get kids at a very early age so that they're going to grow up with the view that people had no control over how they turned out? And if they're one of the lucky ones who wound up like getting a good university degree or even just had running water and electricity at home, that doesn't mean they're more entitled to cut in the front of the line when something's being handed out to humans. And that's like that one's beyond me. That one is so beyond my pay grade to think about how you educate kids into responsibility is an instrumental thing. Yes, I am the one that did it. I did not just make a statement about my soul, because there's no such thing, but yes, I'm the one who did it. Now we know the sequence of events, and to teach kids that pride has no place in things, and just be grateful that you lucked out and you turned out to be somebody who's good at throwing a football 60 yards, or taking out brain tumors, or writing poetry, or being likable and empathic.
Just hit the nail on the head. I've got a 16-month-old baby, and reading your books over and over again, and trying to, even with Tangled Wings, and trying to do exactly what you said in this world, especially nowadays. It's hard, and it came in mind how we can take parts of that and create a fairy tale for kids to understand. Like, that's the first thing that came up, because 16 months ago I didn't even think about those things. That's why I say that genes are waiting to express themselves, because the thoughts I have now, having a kid, I never ever had those thoughts before. I remember my dad was saying that, wait till you have kids, and I was like,
yep.
What's that? Is that a punishment? Like, why is he saying that way? First thing I did, I called him up and I said, I apologize 1,000 times.
Exactly. Because you're like shaping stuff big time, directly, indirectly, all sorts of circuitous routes of influence. And, you're helping to create an organism with certain views about why we're here, and if life is beautiful, or if what happens after you die, or any of those big picture things, and what you owe your fellow human, and what's the basis of goodness. And good luck not screwing up with that somewhere along the way.
Yeah, because it's thank you, but it's hard to balance, between kind of realism and optimism.
Yeah. I think, there's, people with clinical depression, one of the standard pictures is that they are cognitively distorting. Sort of cognitive psychology, cognitive behavioral therapy, a backbone of that is that there may be a traumatic failure, disaster, trauma, whatever, in somebody's past, and that was legitimate. But the cognitive distortion is deciding now, this is the whole world, this is inevitable, this is my future, it's all going to be awful. And dismantling that cognitive distortion is like one of the things that therapy can be quite effective at when things are going well. But at the same time, this remarkable finding is people who are clinically depressed, when you ask them about the nature of the world going on around them, and how likely do you think it is that this is going to happen, and what percentage of people, and they turn out to be more accurate than most people are. Your average non-depressed individual is pathologically optimistic. And this has given rise to the soundbite of people with depression as sadder but wiser. And you get a very insightful sort of finding with that sit someone down like that and ask them, tell me about, what someone should be doing in Zambia and what you think the likely outcomes, and they're like much more accurate than most people are. Tell me about these issues playing out for you. That's where the distortions come in. So if they're capable of like a detached distance from it, they don't fall for rationalizations and myths and all of that as readily. I mean, one of the great sort of definitions of depression is it's a pathological failure of being able to rationalize away reality. So looking at the world around, it's a more rational view. So it's a very narrow beam to negotiate between when a little bit of distortion and denial and all of that is therapeutic for every one of us out there, and when in the long run that gets a slippery slope that winds up biting you in the ass.
It's always going to be a slippery slope when you dive into that kind of rabbit hole, because there's so many things to take on board. We know this world is all smoke and mirrors, to be honest. And for those that are trying to get a deeper understanding from how the creature functions, how it was actually created, and how it functions in different environments. And we think all those scientists you included on actually kind of filtering all that, non-biased, and giving all that opportunity to understand all that. But now we've got AI, and I have to make this question, right? Because AI is growing more complex. And do you ever see them like challenging human kind of centric notions of free will?
Oh, I'm so dreading that you would ask me something like that, because I know nothing about AI. I can't.
I don't either.
Okay,
And that's
good.
why, because, to be honest, there are a lot of, I've seen that in university when, students say, oh, you know what, I just did that and it gets so easier. And I'm like, well, if you don't make your hands dirty, it's not going to stick.
Yeah.
Yes. You know what I mean? Like, so that's why, because same here. And I just wanted to see your views because I have no understanding at all.
Yeah, our son is a computer scientist who does machine learning, and it's completely a function of his mood. On some days, he'll say, with AI, with machine learning, with all these advances, the first immortal human is already alive. That's how great it's going to be. And then you get him on a down day, and he says, 20 years on the outside before the machines just cannibalize us for our carbon. So, like, even people who know something about it, it's like heavily a function of their state of mind. I'm very glad to see that AI people, though, are repeating something that occurred in the 70s and 80s, which was the first generation of genetic engineering people getting together and very forcefully coming up with their own rules of what stuff they were not willing to do. This famous Asilomar conference. And that's been kind of the moral backbone that has prevented some real disasters with molecular engineering, genetic engineering. I hope the AI people do something like that. There's a whole lot more money flying around in the AI realm than back
100%.
in the early. So the temptations to decide, screw it. I'm just going to go ahead with this because, damn, the investors are going to be really pumped on that. So I'm not wildly optimistic, but I sure hope they do something like that. At the very least, figure out a way to keep my students from using ChatGPT to write their papers.
You said something before when we were chatting about that you wanted to spend more time with toddlers, kids, generally, children's behavior, and how the aspect of kind of punishment and reward. And now, as we were chatting, it came up. How does that kind of determinism account for kind of extraordinary talents or geniuses? Are products of like deterministic kind of processes, or?
Yeah, everything comes with variance. Everything comes with variation around the mean. Everything comes with some flavor of a curve, a bell-shaped curve, most typically. And, when by chance you get a bunch of these traits that all happen to be way out on the tail of each one's distribution, you put them together, you get a very atypical human, which sometimes produces some pretty great unexpected results. But it's just as mechanistic. There's no magic going on there either.
There are a lot of people that always ask, what would you do if we went 50 years back? And I'm like, I don't know, because the spider web wouldn't be the same, or there wouldn't be a spider web. So, and you see that in many interviews, like, how did that happen? And I'm like, no idea, because if I knew that, I would be the richest person in the world. I've seen all, and I do that because it helps my students as well. And I see all your lectures. You've shared many fascinating anecdotes in your lectures. Do you find that humor helps you convey complex truths about human behavior?
Enormously, mainly because it wakes people up who are just dozing off. And I think, kind of as a lecturer, the best gift that I stumbled into, for which I can only feel gratitude, is I have a very good intuition for when, like, 30% of the audience is bored and spacing out versus 50% versus 70%, and time to, like, throw in something that's going to be, like, alerting. So yeah, right. Like, a lot of this stuff is very, very thick, factoid laden sort of information. And, in science, you got to do a lot of grunt work in the trenches before you can start focusing on big picture stuff. So yeah, you really got to make it worthwhile for people to stick with you through all the multisyllabic words.
It's what sometimes, like, people are, and I saw some of the comments all those years, and to me it's boggling what keeps you motivating in a world when determinism might make everything kind of seem inevitable.
Because again, that's totally compatible with amazing change. I mean,
Thank you.
one single fact should sustain us, which is, out there exists a thing that we would call an ex-white supremacist, an ex-neo-Nazi, someone who's gone and paid to have their tattoos taken off. Change happens. And, like, when you see one case like that, that's enough to make you think, no, we're not the captains of our ship, but let me understand more about where the buttons and levers are on the machines that we are, so that it's easier to turn neo-Nazis into ex-neo-Nazis, and to turn thems into us's, and for you to figure out, capacity for empathy in areas that never would have occurred to you. Yeah, we change.
I think that in that aspect, you've kind of, people think that you're taking people away from their faith. And that's something I always say, that no, it's exactly the opposite. And people want to latch on things. And, I'm from Greece, heavy kind of Christian Orthodox, and I was always the problem kid at school, because I said, I'm not buying this and all that. And, justice, and there's someone, and then George Carlin said, imagine that people want to kind of believe in the invisible guy, but if they see a stool that says it just painted, everybody's going to put their finger on it. And it didn't make sense to me. And from a religion standpoint, because you come from a heavy kind of religious background, it shows that you kind of stepped away, and that's change.
Yeah. It all evaporated at once, and I haven't been capable of a shred of religiosity or spirituality since then, sometimes to my regret. But yeah, change happens. And one of the sort of pitfalls, when people think about it, is if somebody winds up being exactly like their parents, it's not hard for people to see a lot of determinism that went on there. Yeah, I want to be. If somebody winds up being exactly the opposite of their parents, there was just as much determinism that went on. If somebody winds up being like their parents in this way and that way, but in this other way, they're much more like that really influential teacher they had in third grade, that's just as deterministic. But it's much easier to see when we wind up resembling where we came from rather than, having gotten bits and pieces carried on.
I remember the book that you told me to get with, the wing, Tangled Wings, and I wrote something, and he said, and I quote, "Emotion, like every other facet of human life, is not a free-floating experience, but something deeply rooted in biology, shaped by the brain's wiring and the history of our evolutionary past."
Yeah.
Religious, you know what I mean? Like anywhere you trying to add it, it's all the questions you didn't answer, and you took them without thinking and without kind of questioning anything. And I read somewhere in the Bible that, in a way, I'm going to try to translate it. Well, don't question actually anything. How can you take that? You know what I mean? It's
whereas one of the sort of humanistic skepticism is question everything and read the fine print on everything. So
look at a kid, like he wants to touch and question and he's like a small scientist, and you're like taking that person, telling them this is it, that's what you're going to do.
Yeah, exactly. And saying, and if you don't, there's a very bad outcome way down the line for you.
If you don't mind, I'm going to just read a few thoughts and tell me if you agree or not with when I was writing this kind of letter. And I wrote it first to me because I like writing, but then I said I want to share. It's the first time I do that. And I said, free will does not exist because we do not choose even the fundamental aspects of our existence, such as whether we are born and the circumstances of our birth. Ethical and moral dilemmas arise, but they seem to stem from our genetically programmed nature. We're in essence programmed beings playing predetermined roles. This explains the moral and ethical diversity among individuals. Everyone follows their destiny or fate, which is kind of inescapable. In summary, perfection, logic, and uniformity create stagnation. Life is akin to a scripted reality show that flows like a river, requiring a storyline and a variety of roles, just like any series or movie. Freedom, peace, democracy, and other ideals do not truly exist. The moment our essence incarnates into matter, freedom ceases to exist. We are bound to the pursuit of everything. Tapadari, everything flows. Our imperfect physical bodies with inherent weaknesses and needs for food, shelter, clothing, enslave us. Moreover, we're controlled by those who dominate money, science, media, propaganda, and decision-making. And then we got philosophy, which to me is a research through self-awareness for the Supermacht that encompasses everything. This quest is ongoing, study of life and existence. If we were to abolish laws, penalties, traffic signs, and signals, everything would collapse. The illusion of intelligent beings would shatter. Consider the chaos that would ensue with educating, training, specialization, or societal structures. We are born as blank slates, rather we're shaped by others and adapt to our environment. In essence, we're merely vessels of reproduction and narcissism designed for the continuity of life. If we had to embrace even one structural falsehood about existence, we're inevitably deceivers, just like the world itself.
Well, I would agree with most of that. Two nitpicky things. I would make things a lot broader than merely the genetic aspects of biology, but genetics plus hormones plus et cetera,
Yeah, and it just 100%. Yeah.
Yep.
Not genetically for genes, but yeah.
And the other is the notion of, we are born blank slates and are then shaped by circumstance, environment. It's not such a blank slate, and where the lack of blank slateness is most important is it makes you more or less malleable to certain types of influences. It makes it easier for certain of them to change you. It makes it harder for others. It predisposes you. It's the way in which the slate is not blank is all about potentials and vulnerabilities and possibilities and how it will react to the world around. So it's really, you don't have to choose between the two. In terms of that being, I think, a false dichotomy.
If you were to write a book, one of my favorites, Santiago Ramon Cajal, he wrote a small book, advice for the kind of the young scientists. What would you advise the future scientists out there?
Oh,
including me.
I think for the ones who are, I've spent my scientific career around some pretty driven, accomplished scientists, and some of whom have hit the jackpot and things of that sort, and thus a lot of younger scientists who emulate that, as I certainly did. I guess the one piece of advice is just be very, very careful what you do with your ambition, because for everything you devote yourself to out of your ambition, everything you say yes to, you're implicitly saying no to 100 other things. And think very carefully about what that list includes and whether it's really a good idea. Almost certainly, that's a list that can only be then evaluated post hoc by the time somebody is getting all cranky and arthritic. But to the extent that one can do that as a 20-year-old or 30-year-old, and that's sort of the advice that I give. You can't do everything, and really think about the stuff you're saying no to each time you sign up for a very driven, ambitious yes.
Have you regret any yeses?
Yeah. I was going to cure a gazillion different neurological diseases and usher in world peace and decode baboon language and all of that at various points early on. And I was willing to work very, very hard. Years and years of 80-hour weeks in the lab, and very, very driven, and either that version or living alone in a tent in East Africa. You kind of lose a lot of other primate predilections. So that I have some regrets in that realm, and thank God I lucked out in terms of finding someone and eventually kids who could deal with the extent to which that has been an uphill battle learning experience for me.
There's always a trade-off.
There's always a trade-off. Yeah, there always is.
What's next for you, Dr. Sapolsky?
Well, at this point, in what by now is a recognizable phase for me, which is the notion that ever having the concentration span, ability to think, remember anything ever again, precludes, that's it. I've shot my load here with this last book. So it's just going to be like naval contemplation. By the rhythm that I've had with previous books, somewhere 3 to 6 months from now, something should light up and I'll be on to another project. But right now, it just seems inconceivable.
Dr. Sapolsky, I really appreciate your time and you spent with me and being always there when I needed you. And thank you. I really appreciate you, sir. Thank you for your time.
Well, thank you. This was a pleasure, and enjoy your 16-month-old.
Thank you so much.
Good. Take care.